The story revolves around a brave man who took it upon himself to eliminate the Führer of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. The film opens with George Elster, the main character, placing a bundle of dynamite into a hole drilled into a wall. He takes meticulous care to set up the clock mechanism that will trigger the explosion, inspecting it thoroughly while his hands are smeared with blood. After pulling out a pocket watch to check the time, he secures the hole with a wooden board. Once he is satisfied with his setup, he makes a final check of his work. George then quickly moves to a large empty hall that is set up with tables. In the hall, there is a podium with a Nazi flag behind it. The scene shifts to Munich on November 8, 1939, where hundreds of Nazi soldiers are assembled in the hall to listen to a speech by their leader, Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, George attempts to cross the German-Swiss border. He takes a pair of wire cutters from his pocket and moves towards the wire fence, but is stopped by the German border guards. George claims that he is looking for an old friend who was involved in a folklore society, but his story raises suspicion. The guards take him to the police station where they inspect him. They discover a blueprint of the hall, his passports, wire cutters, and a communist badge on his coat. As a result, George is taken into custody by the German authorities. A short time later, the city is rocked by a loud explosion, plunging it into chaos as news spreads about an attempt on their leader's life. Heinrich Müller, the chief of staff for the Imperial Security Directorate, is quickly informed about the attack on the Führer. The secret police are promptly mobilized to investigate the incident. A team of Nazi soldiers is sent to the town of Königsberg to question local residents. They speak with the local party leader, Eberle, and ask him to identify George's relatives. Despite Eberle's attempts to explain that they are innocent, the captain insists that they be brought in for questioning. Eberle then introduces each of George's relatives, including his former fiancée, Elsa. After gathering everyone, they are taken to Berlin for further interrogation. Later, Neba, the head of the criminal police, along with his team, reviews footage from the scene of the explosion, showing the hall completely destroyed. George, now a prisoner, is brought into an interrogation room where torture instruments are laid out on a table. When Heinrich and Neba arrive, George does not acknowledge the customary Nazi greeting, instead offers a neutral good afternoon. The officers inform George that he is held responsible for the deaths of 7 people, including a waitress. However, Hitler's assassination attempt ultimately failed because he left the hall 13 minutes before the explosion. As the officers inform George about the failure of his plot, they notice his evident disappointment. Neba then instructs George to remove his pants and reveal his knees, suspecting that the bomb could only have been planted while standing on them. Upon taking off his pants, he has visible bruises on his legs. Despite this, George refuses to confess to his actions or answer the inspector's questions about the assassination attempt. Instead, he remains silent, choosing to hum a nostalgic tune from his past. The scene then flashes back to George's younger days, where he is seen enjoying carefree moments. He has a girlfriend named Bruni, but their relationship lacks commitment. They happily spend time at a lake, playing and having fun with their friends on the shore. As the group sings and dances by the water, Bruni dances with another man to provoke jealousy in George. In response, George approaches a different woman and dances with her. Later, he also shares an intimate moment with this new girl. The next day, while George is working, he receives a letter from his father. The letter reveals that his father has sold 2 more pieces of their best land, which makes George extremely angry. He quickly returns to his hometown, Königsberg, where the locals greet him warmly. He notices that the streets are covered with Nazi propaganda posters. Upon arriving at his home, his mother welcomes him with a deep sense of relief. When he asks about his father, she sadly informs him that his father is inside the house, passed out drunk. As he goes inside, he is confronted with the unpleasant sight of his father unconscious on the couch, which leaves him feeling disgusted. The next morning, George helps his father chop the wood in the yard and feels disheartened when he sees his father begin to drink. They have a brief argument over this. Later, George is jolted back to reality when Heinrich punches him in the interrogation room. In the interrogation room, George is asked his name and date of birth multiple times, but he stubbornly stays silent. Other officers then drag him to his feet and strap him onto a metal spring bed, preparing to torture him. Despite the intense pain, George refuses to speak. He endures severe whipping and screams in agony. When this first round of torture fails to break him, he is subjected to more horrifying methods, including having red-hot needles placed under his fingernails. Even with these extreme measures, George remains silent. Eventually, he is thrown into a cell without revealing any information. After the intense interrogation, Neba and Heinrich return to their office to decide on their next steps. Neba argues that there is already enough evidence against George, but Heinrich insists that the leader requires a written confession. Heinrich proposes using threats to force George to sign the confession, while Neba prefers a gentler approach. He suggests bringing in George's relatives to persuade him to tell the truth. Later, George is brought back into the interrogation room with Neba and Heinrich. As Neba calls one of his relatives, George is transported back to his past, where he is playing a musical instrument with friends at a club. He notices a woman named Elsa, wearing a red skirt, entering the bar with her drunken husband. George sees how the husband mistreats her, so he deliberately stops the music, causing Elsa to leave the bar. George follows her outside and they share a dance while he hums. Inside the bar, Nazi supporters celebrate their victory and the defeat of the communists in the election. The working-class patrons extend their arms and cheer for the Nazis, anticipating a shift in history, leading to a fight between supporters of opposing parties breaking out in the bar. However, George refuses to join in the violence and stays outside with Elsa. They share a kiss, but their moment is interrupted when George's friends leave the bar with injuries and call him a coward for not joining the fight. In the present, Elsa is brought into the interrogation room and asks George if he is guilty of the accusations against him. Before they can say much, Elsa is quickly taken away by the other officers. George demands to know what will happen to her and where she is being taken. The officers tell him that her fate depends on his confession and says that they will threaten her life unless he admits everything. George is then returned to his cell, where he kneels, folds his hands in prayer, and prays to the Almighty. He knocks on the cell door, asking to be taken back to the officers. In the interrogation room, George asks for assurances about Elsa's safety. The officers dismiss her importance, saying they only care about his confession and will not harm her if he confesses. Desperate to protect Elsa, George begins to confess, admitting that he acted alone. Noticing his willingness to talk, Neba retrieves the red front badge they had taken from him and questions him about it. George explains that although he had the badge, he was never a member of the Communist Party. He only joined for the sense of companionship. The scene flashes back to a time when George and his friends were out at night painting "Workers Vote for the German Communist Party" on a fence with white paint. They are in a hurry to finish their task and do not have enough time to fix a spelling mistake on the fence. As they work quickly, the police suddenly show up, forcing them to leave the job incomplete. George warns his friends about the approaching police, prompting them to quickly flee the scene. He chooses to stay behind and finish the job, while the police pursue his friends. In the present, Neba doubts George's claim of having no connection to the Communist Party. He argues that someone with no political convictions would never attempt to kill Hitler, but George remains firm in his statements. George then asks if he can write a brief letter to his fiancée and his mother, but the officers ignore his request and do not allow him to write. Next, Neba and Heinrich report George's statements to their supervisor, who is skeptical about George acting alone. He doubts that George could have built such a powerful bomb by himself and believes there must have been accomplices. The supervisor insists that the interrogation must continue to uncover any possible collaborators. During the next interrogation, the officers press George to reveal who else he is working with. George claims that he received a call from Churchill, who allegedly asked him to build the bomb. He explains that with only 2 telephones in the village, it would have been unwise to call the mayor. Knowing that George's claim is unlikely to be true, Heinrich becomes enraged. He pulls George off his chair and restrains him on the metal spring bed used for torture. As George is subjected to pain, he screams that he can prove his statement if they just give him a pen and paper. As George tries to draw his proof on a piece of paper, with blood dripping from his nose, he is taken back to his past memory. One evening, while he is at a bar with his friends, he notices fresh scratches on the face of Elsa's husband. The man boasts that he has taught Elsa a lesson, making it clear that she won't be able to speak up for a while. Hearing this, George exits the bar and rushes to Elsa's house and finds her in bed, covered with bruises all over her body. Elsa initially hesitates to see George in her condition, but when George insists on staying, they share an intimate moment together. As time goes by, George learns that they might be evicted from their home due to debts. He also discovers that many residents in town are struggling financially. In a conversation with his mother, it becomes clear that George has abandoned his first wife and child, and Elsa's daughter is not actually her husband's child. Despite these complications, George and Elsa's relationship remains unaffected. One morning, as George arrives home, one of his friends asks for his help because the Nazis are rounding up communists. At the same time, the Nazis arrive there and arrest his friend. But they do not take George away, since he is not an official member of the party. This leaves George worried and fearful about what might happen in the days ahead. By 1934, even young children are being exposed to the Nazi propaganda displayed around the city, which is now decorated with Nazi flags. During the Harvest Festival, George and his family go to church. As they walk, George notices his friend and other party members, looking worn out and dirty, being transported to an unknown location. When they arrive in town, they see the entire community celebrating the new regime with extravagant food. There is also a movie screening in honor of the holiday. The leader of the party cell gives an enthusiastic speech about the bright future under Hitler's rule, and the crowd applauds eagerly. Although George and his family are invited to join the festivities, they decide to go home instead, not wanting to be part of the celebration. George briefly enters the camp to observe the environment but quickly leaves. As he is leaving, Eberly remarks that they are fortunate to still be able to move freely in the village. In the present, George is returned to his cell. Neba comes to visit him, bringing some food. Neba questions George about the details of the bomb he built. George explains that he stole the gunpowder from his workplace and the dynamite from the quarry. Despite George's explanations, Neba remains skeptical that George acted alone. After Neba leaves, George is left alone in his small cell. The bright light and the confinement make him feel exhausted. As he sits in his cell, he begins to think back to his time with Elsa in his small town. Another flashback takes George to a time when he is enjoying moments with Elsa and her children. They had made plans to live together, hoping to spend more time with each other. Elsa also shares the news of her pregnancy. At the same time, George's own family is evicted, so he starts renting a room in Elsa's house, pretending not to know her. One day, as George is returning home, he sees Nazis publicly humiliating the wife of a local Jewish resident. They force her to walk through the town square with a shameful sign around her neck, displaying her disgrace for everyone to see. This incident deeply troubles George and makes him realize that the situation is deteriorating rapidly. A few days later, George receives an unexpected visit from a friend who has escaped from a concentration camp. Elsa and George offer their friend food, and he explains that he was released into the city due to good behavior, but he is advised not to contact anyone. He shares his experiences of the suffering in the camp and informs them that the place he is working for is now hiring. Later, George starts working as a carpenter in a steel mill and reunites with his friend. He asks his friend about the secrets the Nazis are hiding, but his friend has no idea about it. George secretly listens to radio reports about the German army bombing a Spanish town. He also watches a broadcast of Hitler's speech and realizes that the country is heading towards war. The next day at work, George tells his friend Joseph about what he has discovered. George decides that Hitler must be stopped immediately before it is too late. He shares his plan to detonate the bomb in an attempt to halt the madness. Although Joseph has doubts about their ability to make a difference, George is resolute in his decision. One day, while George is working on a crib for Elsa's unborn baby, Elsa walks in and they start to kiss. However, Elsa's husband, who has seen them through the window, rushes inside and begins to attack Elsa. Upset by the ongoing abuse, George grabs a knife and threatens Elsa's husband, forcing him to leave. Afterwards, George tries to comfort her. He tells her that they need to leave and explains that with his new job and side work repairing furniture, they will have enough money. He mentions that there are affordable apartments in Heidenheim, but Elsa points out that those are only available to labor front workers. George reads about Hitler's traditional speech in the newspapers and realizes it will be held at the same pub where he used to hang out with his friends. He starts to develop an assassination plan. To prepare, George frequently visits the hall, carefully studying the layout and taking precise measurements to execute his plan. He moves to Munich and arrives at a brewery. He carefully inspects the interior of the room while hiding from the employees, planning to stay the night and continue his observations. George measures and records the dimensions of a column where he plans to place the bomb, ensuring it will be positioned accurately behind Hitler during his speech. In the present, George details the reasons and methods behind building the bomb. He describes the design and construction of the explosive device, showing that it was based on his own drawings. Experts, including those from outside the investigation, confirm that George constructed the bomb on his own. During another interrogation session with Neba and Heinrich, they expressed their surprise that a skilled craftsman like George would be involved in such activities. George explains his belief that Hitler is harmful to their country and that the people will suffer because of his actions. He argues that killing Hitler is necessary to prevent further war and bloodshed. Heinrich responds by saying that discussing humanism is irrelevant since another injured man from his explosion has died during the night. After hearing George's final statements, Neba instructs the transcriber to document his confession. The officers then leave the room with the written transcript. Seizing the opportunity while the room is empty, George asks the transcriber to send a brief letter to his family and to Elsa, simply reassuring them that he is doing well. She then hands over a photo of Elsa from the file and requests that it be kept hidden. Back in his cell, George looks at Elsa's photo and reflects on his past. In his past, George finds out that Elsa has given birth to a baby boy while he is hiding in the bushes, focused on his assassination plan. When Elsa's husband goes out to celebrate, George sneaks into their house to see her, but quickly leaves, claiming he needs to get back to work. He then heads to a large open area where he tests his plan. Specifically, he experiments with an improvised explosive device, and the test is successful. In the present, as George and the officers are about to take a crime scene photo, their supervisor storms in, furious over the report claiming that Hitler is harmful to Germany and must be killed. In his anger, he bangs George's face on the table several times, insisting on knowing who ordered the assassination. The supervisor then tells Heinrich and Neba to do whatever it takes to find out who is behind George. Following this, George is taken to a room where scientists use drugs to force him to talk. Under the influence of the medication, George recalls a painful memory, the death of Elsa's newborn baby, which caused tension between them. One morning, George packs his belongings and leaves the attic. Before he goes, he assures Elsa that he will return to marry her and move with her and their children to Switzerland once his plans succeed, which he says he cannot reveal to her. Under the influence of the drugs, George has a change of heart. He decides that he wants to make amends with the German people through his work. He realizes that if his assassination attempt had been successful, it would have meant he was on the right path. Since the attempt failed, he believes this is a sign that he needs to follow a different path. George then signs a confession, accepting that his actions were misguided and expressing his desire to atone for his mistakes. In 1945, 5 years later, Neba is dragged into a private room and accused of plotting another assassination attempt against Hitler. After his crimes are announced, Neba is sentenced to death and executed by hanging in the concentration camp where he has been imprisoned for the past 5 years. George hears about Neba's execution from one of the guards. The news makes him realize that his own execution is imminent, and he anxiously waits for his turn. Concerned about how he will meet his end, George inquires about the quickest method of execution, whether by gas, hanging, or firing squad. However, the guard does not respond to his question. Later that evening, the guard informs George that the Americans have bombed Dresden. Soon after, more soldiers arrive and take George away. Heinrich orders George's execution, intending to disguise it as an accidental casualty of the bombing, ensuring that only a few selected personnel are aware of the true situation. The guards then line George up against a wall and shoot him in the back of the head, keeping his courageous actions concealed. A few days later, on April 29, 1945, the camp where George was imprisoned was finally liberated. It took Germany decades to acknowledge George as a resistance fighter. Meanwhile, Elsa remarried twice after their separation, but she never truly moved on from the love of her life, George. Despite her new beginnings, George's memory remained a constant presence in her heart.